but I really wanted to talk and to break down how not to talk about climate change because it's something that it's a crisis that is certainly so important, and you can feel it, and a lot of people get very depressed when they recognize that there just really isn't very much being done. A lot of people get extremely moralistic about it instead of materialistic about it, in the sense of people think about these things being individual moral choices versus what they really are systemic choices that we need to organize collectively to tackle. um, and they certainly, climate change and the things that drive it rub up against almost everything that we talk about on this program, right? From workers' power to anti-imperialism, um, to organizing. Um, and we'll talk more on the show about the invasion of Ukraine later. But when it comes to climate change, this has undoubtedly reminded people of the politics of fossil fuels, right? You're seeing things like the Dutch government, for example, saying it's unfortunate, but they can't get away from Russian oil. And the Americans, right? Um, offering to partially end their stranglehold on the people of Venezuela, so that they can up production there to maybe keep gas prices lower in the United States, right? I mean, you can see really how the business of fossil fuel and fossil fuel production plays a major role in international and national politics, right? It's not a surprise to most people, but this is one moment where it's extremely visceral when you're starting to see all these fissures developing around this issue. Now, one would hope, though, when this gets sort of brought up to so many people, that this would be a window for a better rhetoric. But what I can see, from what I can see, it's the right and the fossil fuel industry that are winning this moment, right? As more and more people, particularly in the US, are open to this rhetoric of the temporary need to drill, 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 right? I've talked a lot about how the American Petroleum Institute has really been using this crisis to try to push and argue for Biden to allow them to drill more and more. And what has the Biden administration's response been? Bragging about the insanity and the climate denial policy that they've been pushing, which has allowed more oil and gas permits on publicly owned lands than Trump or Obama or Bush, right? That's something that the current administration is bragging about. Remember all this kind of rattling we were hearing in 2020 about, believe the science? It's amazing how quickly that gets thrown out of the window for political expediency, right? So we're getting that kind of, disaster boiling up in the Biden administration. And what are we getting from other members of his policy? We're getting this kind of visionless nonsense from Biden's climate fella, John Kerry, who was in Houston this week, who was shouting platitudes to the fossil fuel industry about natural gas and reminding the fossil fuel industry that they are in the driver's seat. This is a direct quote from John Kerry in Houston this week, where he said, "No government in the world has enough money to implement this transition," noting we absolutely need the industry at the table. Now, he mixed that in with, moral calls for them to do something, and even some kind of, business logic, saying that if sea levels rise, that's going to hurt the business cycle. I'll tell you this right now, y'all. All you need to do to see how far moral appeals go with fossil fuel companies is to drive across West Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana and see the devastation that has been caused by those industries in those areas, and see the devastation that continues to happen because of unplugged wells. We can send them all the pictures and photographs and letters about how evil that they're being and how they need to have a heart and do something for the people, right, who are suffering. They just turn their backs and move on and count their money. The fact is that the status quo is going to let it all burn. So we can't let them. But what is this future going to look like? What is this future in climate change going to look like? What is a future of, a kind of neoliberal solution to climate change going to look like? We can go through all of the dire warnings, right, about what's going to happen to the environment, to communities, to sea levels. And those are serious and important. But at a certain point, it's really important to start looking at the class dynamics that are at play here. You know, people like to say the line, it's socialism or barbarism. And we need to really look at what that will mean for people. Now, I'm going to share this right quick. And I know this is, tongue in cheek and a joke and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not here to get really worked up about what some people find funny or not. But this does reveal a certain kind of mentality that I think is too dominant, particularly on the green liberal side. But I also see it creeping in to people who consider themselves to be pro worker socialists. This is not the only version of this. This is just the one that I'm going to show. Um, this is this gentleman, Hamish Mitchell. Doesn't matter too much. Just shooting the shit, and he says the national average for a gallon of gas is $4.17. A gallon of Starbucks coffee costs $16.80. Just saying, right? And this isn't the only kind of Starbucks level economist that we've had this week talking about the very, very real thing, which has been a very quick and rapid and devastating increase in gas prices. Look, gas is going up, and that hurts working people. It does. And you might not be in a situation where it affects you directly, particularly if you live maybe in a city that has a functioning or working public transportation system. But for millions upon millions of Americans, when gas goes up, it really hurts them. And yes, we need to get off of a system that's attached to fossil fuels. But if you're going to try to sit here and put your head in the sand and finger wag at people who are struggling, you are a big part of the fucking problem at this point. If you've never been a working person in this country, and I think a lot of people who listen to this show recognize this feeling, right? I've had it too. What it is like when you've had to worry about how you're going to afford to get to work this week, you need to sit down, right? If you were worried about not being able to pay for your transportation, if that is not a worry that you've experienced in your life, it is time for you to shut up and listen. If you get to pick which neighborhood you get to live in, right? Because that's a nice walkability score, instead of picking where you live based on the basic dollars and cents of what you can afford, I really don't want to hear it. When these prices go up, they hurt people, right? And look, when Larry Summers, who was all up in arms earlier about inflation, stops caring and tells people they need to make hard choices between food and fuel as a patriotic duty, you should listen and ask yourself, what side are you on? And here's the Larry Summers quote here. Former Treasury Secretary says, even $5 gas is worth it, worth paying to stop Putin, right? Saying something like that when you've seen the way that our government treats the very real concerns and needs of the American people, both throughout the entire history of this pandemic, and even going into this most recent week. Look at this right here. Tell me how patriotic you feel about this kind of shit. Dems set for House approval of Ukraine aid, drops COVID funds. So the United States government is unable to provide people. We're not even talking minimum. This is sub minimum stuff of making sure people have access to vaccines who need it, making sure that people have access to testing, etc. We're not talking about the more radical things. They're not even radical. The basic things that people need, which is a check from the government to continue to help them climb out of the hole that they've fallen into over these past few years, as people have been suffering, right? If it is the patriotic duty, of people to accept higher prices, the government should be stepping in to help out the people who need it most, right? The greatest trick that the neoliberals and the people in power in the society have played is to turn a societal crisis into a personal one. Let me say that again. The neoliberal model has tricked people into seeing a societal crisis. Climate change is a societal crisis. It's not a personal crisis. It's not an individual crisis. It is a crisis that is caused by the system and the structures that we live in. Neoliberals have tricked people into considering this and thinking about this problem on a personal and an individual level, right? In the neoliberal logic, the destruction, which is the destruction of the collective, the destruction of society. Remember Margaret Thatcher's famous line, there is no society, there's only individuals and families, right? It has had one of its greatest victories um, in the kind of green consensus or environmentalist movement. Look, there is no doubt about it that we need to lower our reliance on fossil fuels. It's as urgent as ever. But we will not get there until we address the reasons why people in the United States of America need to use personal vehicles to get around. And you won't get there if you don't recognize that for years upon years, the fossil fuel industry and the automotive industry have played big games with the government to basically destroy any form of public transportation and to promote highways and extremely spaced out centers where people live, right? That is the contemporary reality for the vast majority of people in this country, right? Now, I know not everybody lives like that. I know some people, people who live in New York or some parts of Seattle, etc., Chicago. They might not be as reliant as people in Jacksonville or in Tuscaloosa. Um, uh, you know, uh, on a personal vehicle to get around. But again, this is the reality for a vast majority of people. And if you want to change that reality, you need to be advocating in a serious way, not in a kind of finger wagging, scolding way, for a real investment in not just public transportation in urban metros, right? But transportation solutions for people all across the country. We need real investment in transportation. We need real investment in retrofitting our buildings. We need nuclear, y'all. And we need a democratically controlled power grid. Because, and I know it's funny to dunk on somebody who drives an F-350 with, a 10-inch lift kit, who rolls coal all the time. Those people, frankly, they drive me crazy too, right? But that person, just even if they're guzzling up gas, are not the real people who are standing between us and real climate legislation, right? That is the fossil fuel industry. That is all the people who are complicit, which is the vast majority of Congress, in protecting their power. And yeah, that is people like John Kerry who have no vision or idea of how to really tackle this thing, except for saying, we want to make sure that the fossil fuel industry has a seat at the table, right? Go and listen to what Shell is putting out. For example, Shell Oil. They have a whole podcast page you can listen to. We've done it. I did a Griscom stream on a little while ago where they talk very seriously about climate change and green energy and all these things. But they do it in a way that will always protect the investments that they have made in continuing to drill and continuing to sell, refine, and produce oil for mass consumption, right? That is what we will get um, with the carry model. So what will happen is poor people, working people, will have to pay higher taxes, will have to pay higher rates on gasoline, right? Well, wealthier people can make this transition into electric cars, hybrids, more fuel efficient vehicles, right? The burden will fall on everyday people, while the wealthy, the upper middle class, will get to wipe their hands clean out of that, feel morally superior to the people who work for them, right? uh, while really at the end of the day, very, very little significant has been done to really curtail the worst effects of climate change, right? Because this is a systemic crisis, this is a societal crisis. Until you start to deal with it on those terms, we won't get anywhere. This kind of hyper focus on individual individual purchases, individual consumption choices is a way for the organizations and the forces, right? That's fossil fuel capital, and that is the American government for the vast majority of its history over the past 100 years. Has been absolutely complicit in making this current reality, where people are dependent on fossil fuels. And if you don't want to come up with a solution, if you don't want to be promoting solutions that find a way to help out the vast majority of people, right, get out of this crisis, but rather find a way for a small group of individuals to enjoy a little bit of moral superiority for to the the uncaring masses, right? We're just not on the same side. Because what's also coming, right, and this is attached to the fossil fuel, and to and to cars and driving and public transportation. What is also coming is a Musk style small is beautiful bullshit. Little co-op solar for the nice neighborhoods and dirty failing grids for the rest of us. They are selling this kind of nice, feel good climate solution for the wealthy. You see it all the time. I'm sure you see it in your areas. They're promoting it like crazy here. The personal house battery, right? Maybe have your own personal way to produce your own electricity, right? That's not a real solution for a large crisis like global energy production and climate change. That's a personal solution so that you can opt out of society, right? The true realization of a kind of neoliberal model of dealing with a massive crisis like climate change. Do it yourself and for your family. Screw everybody else. Yeah, and have your personal choice, right? You get to decouple yourself from the grid, while the rest of us, suffer under uh, dirty electrical grids that are failing, as you've seen that happened here in Texas, and it's coming for a lot of other people too, unfortunately. What we need is democratic control of our electrical grid for expansion, and a real investment into it, and for those things to actually work for the people and not just to make profit for a small group of folks. We need a Green New Deal that is not just a slogan, but it's a political movement. It's one that recognizes that the crisis we are in is caused by the system of private profit, of exploitation of the many. We need, for example, a just transition to go from being a slogan is a good idea, but a lot of people, it's still just a slogan for them, to a commitment, a real commitment to working people and understanding their issues. I can't tell you anything that is more out of touch with that reality than pushing something like, um, you know, dealing with climate change as a personal lifestyle choice or an aesthetic, right? Because that's what they want. That's what Kerry wants. That's what Biden wants. That's what Larry Summers wants. And that's certainly what Exxon wants. Exxon wants to have a seat at the table, right? While we're all sort of pushed out, while they're busting unions across the state of Texas to try to destroy unionized labor in the fossil fuel industry here. While green liberals sit around and instead of trying to attack the structures that are creating this crisis, sit around and wag their fingers at poor people and working class people who are worried about the fact that if the price of gasoline goes up, it means that they have to make other hard choices in their life, right? That is a perfect solution for us to never really deal with this crisis, because the rich will be able to opt out. The rich already are opting out. And we need to start uniting, or else we will be left with the tab. That's what they're doing. You don't have to look too far to see who ends up paying for the devastation of these companies. As I noted earlier, if you look across this state, you see what happens when the fossil fuel industry leaves. They leave environmental devastation, certainly economic devastation, and they don't give a shit. And then guess who has to pay for the cleanup of the unplugged wells, for the cleanup from the devastation in their communities? People and the government, right? That is what we will get if we don't start getting serious about a real class-based, working class-based movement that takes seriously the power structures that got us into this situation today. And the only way that you're going to be able to build that is with real solidarity and understanding of the reality of people who might be different than you. Politics is necessarily about building powerful and large coalitions. We have the advantage that people who work for a wage and people who work for a living is something that unites far, far, far more people than it excludes. And we need to be utilizing that and recognizing that's going to mean building coalitions across geography and culture and language, um, so that we can address this group of people, the capitalist class, the owners class, the people who are invested. People don't recognize how much money is still invested in futures and oil, right? They need to get paid for the investment that they've already made. And if you don't have a political movement that's strong enough to deal with that, right, they will always veto you. And they will certainly veto you if, instead of uniting and finding ways to build a real pro-Green New Deal movement, a just transition movement, a class-based green environmental movement, we will be sitting on the outside while they are carving up a really, really luscious future for them and giving us scraps and environmental devastation. We need to build a movement that doesn't want people to suffer for the profits of big corporations and for the security of the state. But we need to build one that wants to radically shift who is in power and who gets a say.